So I expect by now everyone is a Zoom expert. It's our new reality. So we really don't need to go into a lot of details. If you've been on movement calls before, you know that we very diligently follow the chat to see what's happening there. We'll pick up your questions, comments, and thoughts from the chat. So please use that chat box actively. Do introduce yourselves in the chat box. Tell us where you're from. It's always nice to know who we are sharing this discussion with. This dialogue is the 5th in a series organized by the Movement for Community-Led Development. The series really started out because with the pandemic, very few people will turn around and say directly that no, community-led development isn't meaningful, so we shouldn't be talking about localization. People have recognized the importance of this, yet we've noticed that often when we speak to technical experts, the feeling is, yeah, it's a good thing, but it's not for our sector because our sector is so technical. We need experts and communities who really see the importance of community-led development. We believe that CLD is an approach that's needed in every sector if we want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So these sector dialogues have been designed to discuss and look at how community-led development approaches have been used and are working in different sectors. We also want to think about some of the challenges because let's not be naive about it. We know it's not easy. We know there are many obstacles. So far, we've hosted dialogues on livelihoods, health, access to justice, and WASH, water and sanitation. We've had some really interesting conversations, and we have some position papers coming up on each sector based on these dialogues and what we've been hearing from people. The purpose of today's discussion is to look at the importance of community-led climate adaptations and community engagement in climate. Our dialogue will start with a panel discussion to set the frame for the conversation, after which we will have a short Q&A with our panelists. We want to create a productive and inclusive, inclusion-oriented space. The call will highlight how community-led development is essential to having sustainable and resilient programming that can deal with climate change. We will center women, Indigenous peoples, and communities from the outset of these programs. Then we will go into breakout groups of about 25 minutes each, where we are going to talk about some of these issues, our experience with them, the challenges and solutions. Then we will end with a call to action. Today we have a packed agenda and an exciting lineup of speakers, facilitators, and participants here. For now, I'm going to ask Malaika, who has played a huge role in organizing this event, to introduce the movement, because I know many of you are new here. So over to you, Malaika.
As we know, climate change is the most urgent challenge of our time, and it has significant impacts on all aspects of development endeavors. So in the same way, we have to approach adaptation efforts with an equally intersectional view. We rely on the knowledge of communities who are not only the first impacted, but the first responders and the first adapting. So to begin, we'll clarify what CLD is. Community-led development is a development design that enables locally developed visions and goals, working on local strengths and capabilities and based on local decision-making. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the movement for community-led development was begun in 2015 at the launch of the 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals. Organizations decided that to be serious about achieving SDGs, communities had to be centered. It now numbers 1,500 local CSOs and 74 INGOs in national chapters and working groups that are committed to collective action and committed to the power of communities themselves. The movement emphasizes in all aspects that development is local. So it only makes sense to center and empower locals themselves. Next slide. Yeah, the goals of the movement for community-led development are straightforward. It's voice and agency for women, youth, and all marginalized groups, adequate community finance, good local governance, quality public services, and resilience. Thank you. Next slide. Yeah, so this is the movement's theory of change. It looks complicated. It's very straightforward. It begins by national chapters forming advocacy partnerships and facilitation partnerships that both work together to have a collective impact in each country. With the support of global working groups that work on research, communications, and evidence building, they move forward into the next step. So advocacy partnerships allow civil society to engage local governments, push for decentralization of administration, and again, keep pushing for devolvement of public resources to community level. The advocacy partnerships, on the other hand, allow civil society to, the facilitation partnerships demonstrate the processes by which citizens can achieve self-reliance through bottom-up community-led development action. So these two streams converge, as you can see on the diagram, developing capacity and commitment to community-led development, which follows into a phased process of establishing a nationwide program, which is owned by the country, as has been done in the Philippines and South Korea successfully. To get involved in national chapters, to start up a national chapter, or to get involved in working groups, please do get in contact with us. This can be done on the website, and we will have contact details at the end of the presentation as well. So thank you, John.
Okay, thank you so much, Malaika. And let's see, I think you can take, wonderful, thank you. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Bhumika Machala. She is a political economist with 20 years of experience in structural, racial, and gendered inequalities that arise from the current international financial architecture. She's a senior policy researcher at the Third World Network, where she conducts policy advocacy and analysis in UN processes on financing for development and sustainable development, as well as on the policy paradigms of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. She grew up in Jakarta, Indonesia, is originally from India, and has a MS degree in the International Political Economy of Development from the London School of Economics. We're really delighted, Bhumika, that you could be with us, and it's over to you. And Sarah, do you want to drop the slides or?
Hi, hello, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Great, fantastic. So first of all, of course, good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone from around the globe. I am so honored to participate in this incredible dialogue today on community-led adaptation for climate change. It is an incredibly pertinent time right now in the aftermath of the COP26 summit in Glasgow. We are in a global period during a pandemic with so many multiple intersecting crises that perhaps nothing could be more important than also with the enormous amount of attention on nation states and on processes of global governance. This is really a critical time to center communities, community knowledge, indigenous wisdoms, ways of being and doing that are rooted in the everyday life knowledge and experience of actual communities in places around the world that are experiencing the crises that governments and analysts and the UN, talk about in analytical and theoretical ways. So this is an incredible chance right now to really refocus our attention to what matters on the ground, to bottom up, to the local knowledges that are lived and experienced, that are embodied in actual communities. So it seems like this, is the time. It is the time to center women and indigenous, to center communities, to center the resilience that people on the ground who have been experiencing climate change impacts for so many years, not just in the future, but already experiencing them, should be leading the way forward. So I'm really pleased to be here in this really vital discussion right now. So the way we will proceed is I will introduce the two speakers we have, and then after the speakers, who will each speak for about 10 or so minutes, we will move into about 15 minutes of question and answer, where I will be very happy to collect your questions, your comments, and have an interactive discussion. The discussion will be followed by a breakout group that will be facilitated by two incredible leaders from the Global Youth Biodiversity Network and the Hunger Project of Mexico. And then we will conclude with the takeaways of the breakout groups and a call to action. So let me introduce Heather McRae. She's Director of the Climate Justice Resilience Fund. Heather McRae has served as the Director of the Climate Justice Resilience Fund since its inception in 2016, having previously served as the Director of the Climate Resilience Practice at the World Resources Institute and the Access Initiative. The CJRF, the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, is a global grant-making initiative that supports climate action by youth, women, and Indigenous people, helping these communities share and develop their own resilience strategies, supporting change-making from grassroots to the global level. She has over 20 years of experience working in climate change, community development, environmental governance, and education. The second speaker is Amelia Reyes, Program Director of Policies and Budgets for Equality and Sustainable Development at Equidad de Janeiro. Amelia specializes in gender-responsive policy and budgeting and sustainable development. She has trained in disaster risk management and climate change practitioners, including government officers from the Mexican legislative, judiciary, and executive branch, as well as officers from United Nations agencies at the national and regional levels. Amelia is currently the Program Director of Policies and Budgets for Equality and Sustainable Development at the Gender Equity, Citizenship, Work and Family in Mexico City, a CSO, a civil society organization promoting inclusivity, egalitarianism, and diversity in strategy and development. I am so pleased to introduce these two speakers, and over to Heather McRae.
Thank you so much, Bhumika, and thank you to the MCLD for the invitation to join this event. It's really a pleasure to see the MCLD getting interested in climate change. I know these dialogues have been framed around sectors, but many of us think less and less of climate change as a sector and think of it much more as something that cuts across all sectors. So it's really wonderful that your movement is taking climate change seriously and getting ready to integrate it into this really important perspective on development that we share at the CJRF. The CJRF, the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, we're sort of a mouthful of a name, but it says pretty much everything you need to know about us. We're a re-grantor that was designed to enable philanthropic foundations to pool funding on behalf of climate justice approaches to climate action, and particularly to adaptation and resilience. We were created 5 years ago by the Oak Foundation, which is based in Geneva. And since then, we've gained a number of funding members, and we've seen the world really shift quite a lot when it comes to climate justice. 5 years ago, when we got started, very few climate funders were really centering people in their work. A lot of climate change work was very technical, it was very top down, and we were created to help shift that, to help bring people's real lived experience, people's real priorities on the ground into the center of the design of climate change programming and the kinds of actions that get taken forward. I'm actually really excited to say, though, that whether or not we've succeeded as a fund, we are seeing much more attention to lived experience and to people's real lives and priorities in climate change. You don't see so much news anymore about polar bears or necessarily about scientists. You see a lot more news about how climate change is affecting people, affecting farmers, affecting people who live in forests, people who live in drylands areas. So this is a wonderful shift, and we believe something that will make the climate movement more effective and more able to address the real challenges that we see with climate change coming along. Now, to give you just a little bit more sort of on the basics of what we do, as I mentioned, we're really one of the first major philanthropic initiatives that's framed entirely around climate justice. And we put women and youth and Indigenous peoples at the center of the work that we do. We want to see their rights, their lived experience really centered in climate action. And, imagining, down the road, we're really working toward a world where those who are hit hardest by climate change really can lead the way to a more just and equitable future where everyone can thrive. We really believe that building a climate safe world requires dismantling a range of systemic injustices, whether those are political or economic or social, whether those are gender or race or age, or any of a number of the colonialism impacts that have given us a system that marginalizes some and not others, that makes some more vulnerable to climate change than others, but puts some people on the front lines in ways that give real agency and real need around problem solving. And so there's a real leadership role that we're seeing as well. We support initiatives that deliver tangible on the ground results when it comes to adaptation and resilience. But these are always on a path to that broader and deeper transformation, that broader systemic justice. And this makes for some interesting and challenging grant making. In addition to centering women and youth and Indigenous peoples, we tackle climate justice by centering some of the issues that bring climate change home for many people in the real world. So that's food, it's water, it's people's livelihoods. And then our fourth issue area is migration. We're also working in some of the places in the world where people have been feeling the first impacts of climate change. In Asia, we work and make grants in India and Bangladesh on the coast of the Bay of Bengal. In East Africa, we make grants in drylands parts of Kenya and Tanzania. And then we also make grants focused on Indigenous issues in Northern Canada and Alaska, the Arctic regions of North America, which are changing really quickly. We've been in place now 5 years, I think I mentioned. And one of the things that we've really learned is about the importance of conducting really integrated work. We always want to have at the heart of what we fund communities' priorities for solution sets, really community-led and community-driven solutions, and then also work that raises voice and power around those solutions, that builds communities' advocacy capacity, or that supports the development of leadership at the grassroots level, or activities that build movements and networks and connect people interested in climate change with each other, whether that's locally and nationally, akin to your national chapters, or whether it's internationally and globally. We support a number of global networks of grassroots organizations. Another thing that we find in that integration, right, is that there's no real boundaries the way we tend to think of sector boundaries. And you all know this, I'm sure, from your experience working with local communities, that water and sanitation isn't separate from farming and agriculture and food security. These things are connected to each other. And as a funder, that's been very interesting to explore. So often money is siloed for a particular issue, and it's something we hear all the time from our partners. It's a real barrier to community leadership and to community action. So we've tried as much as we can not to be bound by the issue areas that we have prioritized, and to instead be able to be as responsive as possible to our applicants' definitions of resilience, to their definitions of success. I think the other thing, of course, that comes with that integration that I described, and which, you know, Malika mentioned this idea of intersections and intersectionality. And again, as a funder, sometimes this is a little bit tricky. You know, there's a lot of women's funds out there, or there's funds that are designed for, you know, a particular sector, a particular angle, or a particular solution set. And when people are coming to the table with multiple identities and they have multiple priorities, they're looking for win-win-win across their lives as a farmer, mother, student, you know, daughter, caretaker, you know, just as one example of the many different layers that come to the solution sets that we're looking to lift up and support. And that intersectionality is something that we've found has been strongly of interest to our peers within philanthropy. And there's I think a growing recognition of how climate change plays out in an intersectional world, and how there's a real need for learning around it. But there's also still a lot of confusion at the funder level, that intersectionality isn't somehow as natural as it is at the community level. And so we are often in a position of trying to build that bridge between how funders think in silos and how real life plays out. I was told I only have 6 minutes here, so I don't want to go over time. But I did want to highlight a few things that we're involved in that I think are really aligned with the MCLD, and that I hope you'll explore as your community intensifies its work on climate change and deepens its understanding. There's a whole, you know, there's a whole movement right now that's growing, I think, pretty quickly and energetically around community-led approaches to adaptation and resilience. The recognition that adaptation and resilience are fundamentally local is something that we've seen in the literature for a really long time, and even in a certain amount of programming and funder activity. But the real mechanisms for following the lead of communities are still getting developed, and there's still a long ways to go between talking about community-led work and really doing it. But I think we have seen some important arenas for that, and we've been involved in a number of them. If you go online, first of all, and I'll put a bunch of links in the chat around this so that people can explore this themselves, but just to alert you to spaces in the climate change discourse where there's aligned values and interest. About a year ago, there was a set of locally led adaptation principles that were established as part of the work of a global commission on adaptation. And these were groundbreaking. There's 9 principles that lay out what it means to really be allowing leadership to come to the fore from the local level when it comes to climate change adaptation. And there's now a community of practice around locally led adaptation that subscribe to these principles. There's been a movement and a push to have powerful players at the funding level internationally and at policy level nationally for these players to subscribe to the principles and make commitments around them. And then we've really seen, I think, pretty good momentum around it. And a number of the funding commitments we saw at COP26 cited these locally led adaptation principles and are trying to bring the spirit of local leadership into how the climate agenda moves forward. So that's one space. Related to that, in fact, older than it, like one of the sources of those principles is a long-standing conference series called the Community-Based Adaptation Conference Series, or CBA, Community-Based Adaptation. And I think they held their 15th or 16th annual conference online this year. And it's a wonderful community, primarily from the Global South, of practitioners coming together to share experience, to share techniques, to really learn together about how do you get really good about supporting community-led work on adaptation and resilience. And then the third thing I wanted to highlight was a group we've been instrumental in getting started, and it's still very new, but it's called the Frontline Funds Accelerator. And the aspiration of the group, it's a coalition of a couple of grassroots networks, a funder from the CGRF, a global network around resilience, the Global Resilience Partnership, and a think tank who have come together to say, how can we really focus in not only on getting money to flow from the global and national levels to the local level, but on getting it to be controlled by grassroots groups at the community level? What are the mechanisms for creating that? And I'm sure you've seen in your own work, there are locally created, locally led funding mechanisms out there, but they have been often invisible to the global climate funders and to the larger international development architecture. Making those mechanisms A, really strong and effective, and then B, visible to the broader funding space. And then C, and maybe most important, advocating not just for visibility, but for actual change in the finance architecture that makes it possible for funding to be held and controlled at local level. There's a whole risk perception and trust set of issues where the rules and regulations of a lot of the global funding prevents highly capable, highly effective, highly cost-effective local finance mechanisms from being able to absorb funding, not because of absorption, but because of the rules and the ways that funds are deployed at the global funder level. And so starting up dialogue around what needs to change, not only in strengthening these local mechanisms, but in strengthening the capability of the global mechanisms to see and respond and support these local mechanisms. So all of this is underway in the climate space. It's pretty exciting. I'm sure many of you are aware of related things that I'd love to hear about. And I hope this is helpful as you bring your community-led development spirit into climate conversations. Thank you.
Bhumika?
Thank you, Heather. Yes, indeed. Thank you, Heather. That was a fantastic presentation of some of the key issues going on with the funding arena. I want to now hand it over to Amelia, and over to you, Amelia.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this invitation. I have been thinking about what to share in this session. I think, first of all, I wanted to explain my background, and from that onwards to continue with the reflection. The first element is that this background relates to the macroeconomic approach to gender equality. So this segment in yellow, which is 2/3 of the circle of the global economy, is produced by unpaid domestic and care work that women provide to the global economy. This is non-monetized, meaning there is no money to afford for this. And this is monetized. This is money. This is the global economy. And so you see how women are supporting the entire economy without any monetary recognition. And here you will find, well, here is community work. So you will see as well that men will be doing unpaid domestic and care work mostly in the community segment. But women are, besides doing the unpaid domestic and care work for the families and stuff, they're also doing it for the community. And this is paid domestic and care work. So this also relates, for instance, to migration, to indigenous peoples or migrant people from the global south to the global north. This is paid domestic and care work, and this means that there is an externalization of work so that middle income women can go out to the formal sector or the informal sector to work. So you will see that this area here is money for care, and here is all of the value that is generated in the world that doesn't have any payment. So this is the rest of the economy. This is technology. This is Bezos and Google and all of the money that circulates in the world. Just to say that women get 10% of the world that circulates in the world. 10% of the money that circulates in the world, as opposed to all of the value that women produce. So the first analysis on value refers to the sexual division of labor and how, of course, women of the most marginalized communities, indigenous women, and women from the global south, they are actually doing a lot of more of this unpaid domestic and care work. And now, for instance, with environmental crisis, it is, of course, women from the islands, from the least developed countries, the ones that are undertaking even more work because of the function that women have been allocated in this global economy, which is that women are shock absorbers. So they receive all of the crisis. Whenever there is a crisis, it is expected that women take a further step and add more work into the one that they are already doing. So any replenishment, any retreat from the state means that there is more work for women. Any further crisis, like COVID crisis, like a food system crisis, like biodiversity crisis, climate crisis, all of that increases the amount of work that they're doing. And this is why we're also talking about women. On the one hand, women subsidizing the entire economy, and second, this is the major exploitation that we see in the world. But the second division of labor that we are interested in is the geographic division of labor. And this means that how in the global south, our territories are generating not only value, but also goods and the natural resources. All of these are being extracted and exploited from the global north. So, and this relates as well to the historical responsibility of carbon emission by the wealthy countries and all of the negative impacts that our developing countries are having. So this adds up as this global south being subsidizing the global north wealth. So, and there are many data on this, not only on climate change, but for also, we already know that for $1 that comes out from the global north to the global south on official development assistance, $80 come out from the global south to the global north on illicit financial flows, meaning tax evasions, tax avoidance, corporate tax abuse. So all of that discussion needs to happen as well, because we cannot keep on saying only what are the local solutions, because the local solutions, I'd say, do have a very harsh divide. On the one hand, local solutions refer to the emergency response, the crisis, the constant pressure that the world is having on them. And in second, yes, the local communities and the micro dimension is really upholding the rest of the world. And for this, I'm going to add another division of labor, which is the one that falls under the burden of the indigenous peoples. So we know now that indigenous peoples are 6% of the population in the world, but they uphold 80% of the biodiversity in the world. This means as well that we are living, that the entire subsistence in the planet is upheld precisely by indigenous peoples. And we're having these very minor conversations actually with indigenous peoples on sovereignty, some on reparations, but we're not having, for instance, technical discussions about what are the implications of only 6% of the population saving the life of the 94% of the population, and the procedures, the consumption and the production in our subsistence of the 94% of the world is actually destroying it. So we are not only violating the rights of indigenous peoples, and of course, when you add gender, when you add the geographic location, you will find a deeper and deeper ingrained oppression and the exercise of this burden on work. But it's also, I think, a historical responsibility, a historical conversation that we need to have that also relates to our survival on the planet. And I want to add another discussion that we need to have, because it doesn't relate to the current exploitation, but it refers that for the first time in history, humanity is violating human rights towards the future. So now we haven't focused on that. We are with the climate emergency and with the debt crisis, with the tax crisis, etc. We are realizing that there are extraterritorial human rights violations by the wealthy countries in the global south territories. And that is serious enough. But then when we go to the environmental emergency, we're also seeing that for the first time in history, we are violating human rights of future generations through the measures that have been applied in the false solutions that we saw as the outcome of Glasgow, and that has started in the climate change negotiations. That we see that the net zero instead of real zero, meaning they keep on doing carbon trading instead of keeping the fossil fuels under the ground. They keep on promoting nature-based solutions as a way to keep on promoting large, massive monoculture rather than small the small cultures that local communities know how to do best in protecting the biodiversity, richness, and protecting the ecosystems. But where all of these proposals that came out from the COP really not only undermine the survival of humanity now, they're also violating human rights towards the future. So I'd say we have a challenge in which not only we have, the real interpretation of what this economic system is doing to the population, to the people. And we see, for instance, women, people in the global south, in an exacerbation of women in the global south, plus indigenous communities, plus youth, they are really carrying all the burden of all of these emergencies. So I have a challenge for you, because as I said, we are saying that local solutions are the solutions, but as I said, local communities also have the massive challenge on receiving all of the impacts of the destruction of the world. So local communities need to also face the emergencies, and it is very legitimate for them to do so. We cannot add a burden on local communities in saying, now you have to come and save the rest of the world. But that is one thing that they're doing, and they're doing in an amazing way, and we need to have these dialogues to exchange. How are you doing it? Can you help me understand and learn? But then there is this other local dimension that is very important, that refers to the level of what Bhumika was calling the wisdom, the new practices, the circular practices that are needed at the macro level as well, to change the paradigm. But there is a moment in between that we also need to undertake, which is to understand the macro dynamics and to challenge them with our own practices, because we cannot keep on saying that local is, in an isolated manner, is going to change the world. Just let me put an example. If we find a local entity that was successful, for instance, versus an extractive company, which we know how they deplete the ecosystem, the life of water, plant, air, etc., the biggest success will be to remove that extractive, so that the local economy and the local life is back as it was. But what that global company is going to do is going to go somewhere else to impact another community, perhaps in another southern country. And this is why we need also to learn what are the macro dynamics and engage in the macro dynamics in that field. Because, for instance, we keep on talking about 100 billion for climate finance. It's fine. Most of that should go to communities, but 100 billion as opposed to trillions that the finance industry is shifting to the fossil fuel industry every year, it's totally peanuts. We're not gonna get there, and we keep on insisting on, the 100 billions as opposed to the trillions. We need to understand the macro dynamics, to engage in the macro dynamics, to bring our solutions, but not to dismiss the type of conversations that are happening and that are keep on burdening the local communities. And as I said, I think we need to have clarity on what is the emergency wisdom that local communities have, what is the constructive and, let us say, structural proposals that we can have from micro to meso to macro, and we need to have a clarity in understanding the difference between those three, and to realize that precisely because of we are subsidizing the economy, we have the solutions, but we need to come up with the clarity to explain that and to alter the macro dynamics. Otherwise, the micro will keep on receiving all of the impacts. And the type of exchange that we're having here, for instance, on adaptation, what is it really about adaptation, and what that is really about what the rich countries call resilience, meaning they will survive. We don't want resilience. We want human rights. Human rights empower people. Human rights, uphold. We want ecosystem health, and we want sustainability. So what is the difference between what we are told because we have a strength and resilience, and what it is about, from our point of view, the solutions that we have, not only for our community, but the type of engagement that we can have to really transform the macro dynamics. That's my challenge for you, but also my invitation to learn from all of you, and of course, to hear all of the solutions that are going to come out of this amazing dialogue. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amelia. That was fantastic and summed up so much of the structural and macro issues. I want to hark back to what Heather McGray was saying about that the climate solutions and climate resilience are very much also connected to systemic injustices, which Amelia drew out several of them. But when we talk about systemic injustices, we are really talking about the inextricable linkage between trade policies, between debt policies, between austerity policies and technology policies and climate change, in that there are inextricable linkages between all of the macro policy and economic, trade, and technology governance frameworks in our planet and climate change. It is absolutely inseparable. And here I also want to invoke that during the climate change negotiations in Glasgow, developing countries called out techno-fix, false solutions such as net zero as a form of carbon colonialism, one that follows, a long durée, a long century of fossil fuel exploitation, to now a carbon colonialism which looks like a sort of legitimization of land grabs, otherwise known as green grabs, land grabs, and even the privatization of large tracts of ecosystem services, as they say, which means forests, lakes, the land upon which the rural indigenous of the global south actually live on and depend on for their livelihoods, where this land could be privatized for tree plantations, monocrop plantations, and all kinds of large scale industrial agricultural activities in the name of carbon offset markets. So we are looking at really having to be aware of the very local repercussions of these sweeping technological solutions that have been proposed by nation states. And here I would also like to give the due mention to the global climate justice and global South's long-standing call for climate reparations. Climate reparations meaning not just monetary compensation, but also the national self-determination, policy autonomy, and equity in the international frameworks for the loss and damage being incurred and that has incurred by the ecological harm over centuries of colonization. So climate reparations also really centers the primacy, the role, the leadership of local communities, because it is these local communities that should be receiving the climate reparations. And so we have, a real tension sometimes between the nation state and the local communities that our speakers have also alluded to. So with that, I invite questions, ideas, either, I'm not sure if you can speak, I think if you would like to, you can speak your question, or you can type it in and I will ask it to our two speakers and for community discussion. I think we have exactly 15 minutes.
There's one hand raised, I see.
Great. Gabrielle Klassen, would you like to?
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much. So my name is Gabrielle Klassen. I'm an intersectional activist from Cape Town, South Africa. And so I first want to say thank you for what's been said already. I think it's quite a powerful, especially the points on, ensuring that those from most affected communities are looked after and taken care for. My question is more surrounding, and this can go to anyone, of course, how does one begin the process of highlighting the need for not only mitigation, but adaptation as well? Oftentimes when adaptation is brought to the table, governments often think, or initiatives often think, that they know what's best for the community, when in fact, to your point now that was just mentioned, communities know what's best for themselves. So how does one capacitate a community with the resources that governments or initiatives have without taking away the power that that initiative, or that community rather, should I say, has?
Heather, would you like to take a try, and then I'll turn it over to Amelia?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, there's a couple pieces. Oh dear, as a funder, can people still hear me? Oh no.
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Something's gone wrong. Everything has gone black on my computer, but if you're still able to hear me.
Yep, we hear you.
Okay.
And we see you.
We see you and we hear you.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, fundamentally, there's a couple things that this boils down to. The first one is listening, real listening, and for those with power to listen and to really understand what that capacitation agenda is, I think is a first step. Linked to listening, there's a real need for humility, and the way that individuals bring humility to institutions is something I'm actually really increasingly curious about, and that I think we may need to, dig into some quite personal things in terms of the types of leadership that's needed and the types of interaction and facilitation that's needed. But then, more importantly, right, are the things that we know really empower communities. And this isn't rocket science, it's out there in lots of literature. Strong civil society organizations, such as many of your members, at the grassroots level, are the really important piece of that capacitation. And this is often women's groups. Sometimes it's, economic empowerment or savings groups, but other times it's much more political organizations. Either way, that those organizations need funding, they need organizational know-how, they need rights and respect in the law, they need open dialogue with their governments, and a host of other things that we know are the backbone of capacity at the local level. The question came in a couple different forms, I guess, and I answered with a piece of humility and listening, because it sounded like it was really what should governments be doing, or what should those who have the power and capacity be doing? And honestly, they should be doing what their citizens tell them to do. There should be channels in which those capacitation processes are in response to needs and demands and priorities that can be voiced openly at the community level. And those civil society mechanisms for that voice are one of the first things that should be capacitated. I hope that's helpful, and I hope it's a response to the question. I was a little bit confused.
And over to you, Amelia, and then we'll take a question from Rebecca Dowley.
Yes, thank you. I think it's actually a very complex question, because of course it is very important to give the voice to the local communities, but also to take some distance and understand the structural inequalities all of the population in local communities are at, and do a previous work before that. That is very important, because, for instance, if you go and ask women, what do you want? They will say, we want clinics, we want education. If you ask men, we want basketball grounds, and so it is very important to do a previous work, because women will try to promote community tasks that are related to their mandate, their sexual division of labor mandates, and men as well. So men will go for security and stuff. So you need to go to unfold, to unpack those elements so that women and men respond to those questions in terms of them as subjects of rights. And so that is a very important element. The same with indigenous peoples, the same with youth, and many elements that need to be discussed and bring back at the forefront of the discussion human rights rather than needs, because communities sometimes will go for the needs, and that will address the emergency element that I was saying, but then we always need to leave room for the structural elements that will help communities to live out that situation. And communities know the solutions, but they will have to spare the time to think about it. So that is my first reaction. And the second one is, of course, that all of these processes need to happen without colonial practices, without colonial impositions by either donors or by supposed experts, etc., that are sometimes actually bringing their own agendas. And the third element is, again, my emphasis on bridging with the macro dynamics. For instance, maybe a community now will not say as a first priority, we need a TRIPS waiver so that this Global South access to vaccines. But we know that at this moment, especially with the announcement of the new variant, Africa, for instance, only has access to 7% of the vaccines in the world. And for their emergencies in access to water, on the environmental emergencies, they will rarely mention that at the top of their priorities. But we know that developed countries are responsible of genocide in the Global South. So there is always a need to bring these dialogues about where are we located as humanity, as groups in the power relations, so that communities can also have a saying there, because of course it is crucial for their survival, and to acknowledge their the traditional knowledge and practices that have been going on for centuries. So I'd say it's very important to set up platforms for community exchange and development and solutions, but also to understand, to promote it, to emphasize this dialogue of where are we located, what are the origins of our problems. It is not poverty, it is concentration of wealth, it is this extractive and destructive system that we have globally, and that is actually falling in the shoulders of those who have the least responsibility in generating those problems.
Rebecca Dali, would you like to speak your question?
Okay, thank you so much. My question is, let me start with briefly my experience with 30-something years in humanitarian service. I discovered that local communities, the donors don't really believe in them so much, but they sponsor these gigantic, big donor agencies. And when they sponsor them, then this donor agency will give stipends, small things to the local organizations. And then the local organizations are the one who are working among the communities, bringing data and a lot of things and give to this big international organization. And those international organizations will pack all the data and then present it to the world. But then the proper amount of money will not even be enough to travel and do all these things. And the people in the community whom this international donor agency will budget, like in the Northeast, they will say, we need like $10 million. And that $10 million, what will trickle to the local organization, it will not be up to $200,000. But then those with this $200,000, they are the one who will work and then meet in the community. And even some of the community will lock the door for you, that you keep on coming here, you are not, you just come like a secret services police to collect our data, but you are not giving us anything. And in this climate change, billions or millions are given to the government. But we in the local government, in the local community, we can't access those funds. And the international donors, they will not give us, we that are working. How can you change this synergy, and so that maybe you can give to our MCLD funds, and then he can distribute to us, so that we will work, and then the lives of our people will change, instead of dumping the huge amount of money to some people that are not working. Sorry for talking too much, but this is my concern.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was such a critical question, leading to the heart of everything from autonomy to dignity to justice to the politics of representation, power, control. I would like to hand it over to Heather first, and then Amelia, and then I have been told that we have to wrap up to the breakout rooms. And so I want to just apologize right now to Jacqueline Chishimba, Desaidu, Abdullahi, and to say that your questions will be appropriately answered and be given ample space to in the breakout rooms. That is what I have been informed. So thank you so much. Over to you, Heather, for this incredibly critical question, and then to Amelia. Thank you.
Thank you. And this question, it just highlights how stuck the system is on so many levels. But there's two things I can just briefly mention that we're doing here. There's lots of other things to be done, but two things that we've done as the CJRF. The first, I mentioned the Frontline Funds Accelerator that we're part of, which is working both to build and strengthen that local infrastructure for deploying money, and making the case for changes at the global level amongst the funders to relinquish power and make it possible for those local funds, those frontline funds, to hold more money. The second, and I'll put something in the chat about that also. The second thing to flag is what we've just started as a fund to actually reimagine our own structure and process for grant making. And as we'll launch a second phase of the CJRF next year, in preparation for that, we want to become a much more inclusive and participatory structure, so that decisions about funding are not resting only with funders within philanthropy, but are actively structured, and the processes we work through can be much more responsive to people working on the ground. And we believe we'll become better at supporting them and making sure more money flows that way. It's very early days in this process. We've just launched the redesign of the fund. We don't know in the end what it will look like, because obviously we don't, activists on the ground, they not all of them want to be participating in grant making decisions. It's a lot of time and effort. It's a job. So figuring out how to strike that right balance will be part of a 6-month design process that we're launching now with a number of our partners and others within our community. So watch this space. We want to become one, more of an example and help philanthropy really walk the walk on this issue.
Amelia?
Yeah,
Thank
just
you.
very quickly, I'm not sure how quickly, but just to point out some points of entry. First of all, is that the issue of corporate philanthropy has been and very recently in the attention of the activists, precisely because, first of all, we want corporations to pay their taxes, and they use their philanthropy as a way to evade paying in taxes. And as you, Rebecca, rightly pointed out, actually the massive structure that they set up is mostly for their white staff in our countries rather than really spending on the local community. So that is, those are at the heart of the colonial implication of corporate philanthropy at the moment. And the second one is, for instance, some of those actors in the corporate philanthropy respond to the massive corporations that are actually causing all of the challenges that humanity is facing right now. So the massive environmental and social and economic impacts of Amazons, of the Gates, of etc., all of those actors that also have corporate philanthropy, trying to put a band-aid on the massive wounds and destruction that they're causing to the health of the planet and humanity is evidently insulting. So I'd say we should definitely question the origins of corporate philanthropy. But second, also, given that this is very much related to official development assistance, and developed countries have committed to deliver that, so we are still demanding to receive that aid, but in a manner that is not colonial, that is really going through the actors that are needed. And I will just say that it is important as well that aid comes to governments. I just want to say that there is this report. Bhumika will help me remember the name of the author. This report on illicit financial flows in Africa, the Mbeki report, saying that only 6% in the African region, only 6% of the money, of the public money, goes to corruption. Only 6%. It is, just to say, 30% goes to organized crime, trafficking, etc. 60% of the money that leaves out Africa is for corporate evasion of taxation that is going to developed countries. So we still have this prejudice against governments that say, oh, they are the corrupts, they are the ones that are receiving all of the money, they are the ones that are keeping everything from our people. It's not the governments, it is the corporations. So we need to also, I'd say, engage in this type of conversations, because all of these corporations have a massive presence in our life. Just to say that private money is 300% bigger, larger than public money. And for the rights of women's rights, youth rights, labor rights, we want to strengthen governments. We want to strengthen governments as opposed to keep on allowing the strengthening of the private sector. So these are conversations that we need to have, because in the end, the ones that get impacted the most are, of course, the local communities. So the fight against government corruption versus private government corruption, corporate corruption, I think it is very clear where we should focus at this moment. And I'd say we should really channel our efforts to really address the systemic problems that humanity is facing right now, especially Rebecca, your region, that is now going through a massive backlash, racist backlash due to the new variant, while the rich countries have precisely refused to promote a TRIPS waiver. So these are some of the thoughts that come to my mind when hearing you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you both, Amelia. Thank you, Heather, and especially Rebecca, for asking such a powerful and necessary question. I just want to invoke, that this is really at the core of distributive justice. And distributive justice today it's an old concept. It goes back centuries. There are philosophers who've been talking about distributive justice, and we need it now more than ever. We need to really engage from the very local to the global politics of distribution. So to hand it over to the breakout groups now. Over to the breakout groups. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay,
Great.
so
So
we'll
Sarah,
be-
oh, go ahead, Micah.
So thank you to the speakers. Those are absolutely wonderful. Thank you for your questions. Like has been said earlier, if you want to bring up those questions in the breakout room, that's the ideal place to do it. We will be going into breakout rooms now. Each room will have a facilitator, and together you'll be discussing questions to do with today's topic. If that's the question that someone's brought up, perfect. We'll be in the breakout rooms for about 20 minutes and then return to the event. The facilitators from each room will then share the key takeaways of the breakout room with everyone here. And just in a quick apology, we normally love to have breakout rooms of about 10 people. There's a lot of participants here. Thank you for coming, but it means that there might be a few more people than we normally would have. So yeah, thank you. There should be a request on your screen very soon to move to a breakout room if you could accept that. Thank you.
20 minutes went too fast.
Yes, 90 minutes went too fast. Thank you, Arthur. So Sarah, how are we doing this last section? Who's gonna call on people?
John, I'd love for you to just invite each
Okay.
facilitator to give
Okay.
their one takeaway.
Okay, so who was group one? Who's the group one facilitator? Do they want to share one takeaway from their session?
John, I think I was group one.
Great.
Sarah, is that correct? Okay, so just a quick takeaway in 60 seconds. Great participation from everyone, and I just want to appreciate input from Cassidy, Vincent, Catherine, and Abu, Caleb. I can't mention everyone, but basically we looked at issues around international tech sharing platforms in terms of climate change and how much it is important to have an education scheme put in place, looking at changing agricultural practices. This was something that was very evident in China, and also planting of different fruit trees. For example, Catherine in our group mentioned this is something that communities have been doing. We discussed about barriers. The barriers that have been faced mostly is mindset change. Looking at how communities can go through a process of thinking about climate change differently. And another barrier that is there is industries. Industries do infiltrate and also hinder on climate change because of the production of many different materials. And so one of the things that lastly was contributed was the engagement of children. How to overcome the barriers is to start from the grassroots and really engage with communities so that we can work from the bottom up, engaging with the youth in communities so that they can be able to take this forward. So in a nutshell, that's what Group 1 was able to gather and share. Thank you.
Great, Arthur, thank you. So yes, we're looking forward to another million Greta Thunbergs, please. I was facilitating Group 2. Group 2 was just dove deep into a couple of examples of the enormity of the intersection of insecurity, bureaucratic obstructionism, that some of the greatest community initiatives you've heard of failed in navigating these injustices, and the need for a broader and a deeper approach to transforming those injustices. Who facilitated Group 3?
That could be me, John.
Oh, Deanna.
So I think that my key takeaway from this conversation, first of all, thank you all for sharing sharing their experiences and their thoughts. And I think that something that I hold with this group is that there are a lot of experiences on how projects really address climate change, and how sometimes those projects are not necessarily addressed directly to climate change, but then we see that this is something that we all need to see that gives you some results on that matter. But then it's that there are some common barriers when we came up about we have these experiences, and then we see the context, and we need to break the power holder, and we need to shift the power. Something that I mentioned in the group, that this is something that it's really relevant for the movement, but at the same time, it's like that's like the key barrier for that, and we need to change that, and not to have isolated experiences, but how to break dynamics. And then I connect to what Emilia shared before on these micro dynamics that we need to realize and address, and to make it visible. So I think that that could be my key takeaway. Thank you.
Thank you, Deanna. So I understand from our schedule that our final section is to pass it back to Bhumika for our call to action.
Yes, this has been a fantastic discussion. So many different ideas, voices, from the local level to our speakers talking about systemic issues and the larger global mindsets. Heather bringing in these really important dynamics of local funding and financing, and the challenges, in the funding landscape, and the tensions between global and local funders. And there's nothing that's more needed than greater democratic, equitable, and autonomous funding sources that go directly to the people and communities in the Global South, the people and communities who are living on the land of the Global South. So I just wanted to end with really three takeaways that really occur to me. First and foremost, we are talking about a future where it looks like carbon offsets is going to be a new normal. It's going to be normalized globally. All kinds of carbon offset projects, all kinds of carbon sequestering technologies that may very well further commodify, further privatize, and further perpetuate injustices that in particular rural and indigenous communities across the Global South would face. We have already seen dispossession, we have seen loss of livelihoods, we have seen incredible health and well-being impacts of pollution, of the model of extraction. So here to invoke first and foremost that there is a huge difference between carbon offsets and actually changing the business models that allow big corporations and industrial polluters who constitute 70% of global carbon emissions are in the hands of 100 companies. Let's remember that. And if that business model does not transform, if their business model is allowed to continue extracting through a model of carbon offsets where they can just pay their way to continue polluting, we should not rely entirely on these technological fixes and carbon offset regimes and solutions to really address the enormous existential threat we have of continuing carbon emissions. We must take account of the kinds of relationships we are developing onward with our living environment and ensure that they are not entirely market driven, that they are not entirely metric driven, that we are really corresponding our land to the livelihoods and the wisdom and the ways of living that the communities on that land have always needed. My second key point is, yes, I agree with John fully that we need 1 million more Greta Thunbergs, and in that to also invoke that Greta Thunberg is an international figure primarily because she is from Europe. There are already so many brown, Black, and non-white, youth leaders around the world who are not getting the attention by media, who are not getting the elevation by the international media, which, as we know, has inherent, racist biases. So
Yep.
to elevate, you know, they are the millions of brown and black Greta Thunbergs are there. They are there. They're
Yep.
in Thailand, they're in Nigeria, they're in Ghana, they're in Brazil. They are indigenous, they are from villages, they are from rural communities. And we need to find ways to really elevate them, to have them at the center of panels, to have them the voice of conferences, to put them into the international media. And my message with that is really that movement building to be really from the most local level villages, but also intersecting across the thematic boundaries and segmentations we have in our global movements today. The climate movement cannot be separate from the feminist movement, from the movement on debt justice or tax policies or trade policies or indigenous people's rights or domestic violence, violence against the woman, land rights, rematriation, inheritance and property rights. All of these movements must coalesce in a singular imperative that global justice is indispensable for climate justice, that climate justice is about all of these different themes. And last but not least, I wanted to go back to the kind of relationality that we have developed between human and land, and to really highlight that today we live in a world that has been constructed by colonial mythologies that proclaim that nature is dead and land is empty. These are the colonial myths that have allowed fossil fuel capitalism and carbon emissions to extract so much of nature. Because if land is empty, then rural and indigenous communities can be displaced or eliminated. And if nature is dead, it can be exploited for unlimited resources. So a decolonial and reparations-based ethos needs to de-link from the knowledge systems that are still rooted in colonial and Cartesian paradigms that assumes that thinking comes before being, that separates the human from the land. And it needs to reimagine humanity with the knowledge systems of all who live on the margins, in particular the indigenous. And so to me, this implies a transformative shift towards asserting a world of multiple worlds where hierarchies of supremacy collapse and indigenous wisdoms rooted in interdependent ways of being arise to form a new reality of justice. So with that, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Bhumika and Heather and Elena. It's just been, that is a tall order, and we are going to do everything with every breath in our beings to cause this transformation to happen. It must. So Sarah, you're going to speak to us about next steps and close.
Yes, and gosh, what a pity to have to go from Bhumika's powerful remarks to logistics. But as we bring this call to a close, I just want to flag a little bit of what's going to happen next. So we'll be posting the recording and the key takeaways from this event to our website. And in January, we're also going to circulate a position paper on this topic. And we also have 2 upcoming events that I want to make sure you're all aware of. So 1 week from today at this same time, we're holding a Democracy Summit official side event. We intend to bring the issue of local participatory democracy to the summit. And we want to ensure that world leaders know that decentralization, capacity development, and empowerment of women and marginalized people are essential to strengthening democracy. And the final MCLD Global Monthly Call of 2021 is on December 15th. And now, thank you all for sticking around for an extra 10 minutes. To close this call, I want to give a huge thank you to Bhumika, Heather, Amelia, John, Arthur, Deanna, for their thoughtful remarks, for challenging us to think even more critically. And thank you to all of our participants for bringing your insights and your lived experience to this call. And of course, thank you to Malaika for making this event happen at such a pertinent time. Like Bhumika said in her opening, this really is the time to refocus our attention to communities and to local knowledge. So we look forward to continuing to brainstorm and take action with all of you in the coming months. And now in true movement fashion, please everyone feel free to unmute and say bye. And thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Adios.
Okay, I'm gonna end the call. Thank you all so much for being here.
Bye.